Hello, I'm Miles Godsill, and this presentation is on my replication and creative response for the eel spear from Hereford Resource Centre. I was drawn to the eel spear by its elegant and interesting detail, such as the socket and the arrangement of the tine attachments. The spear can be broken up into three individual sections: the body, comprising of the rivet plate and socket, the tines, and the rivets used for assembly. Here we can see my proposed creation method for the spear, starting with the body. Setting down around halfway on square plate stock to about half thickness and spreading the material into a fan shape, and then cutting the fan shape into the desired shape we want for the socket. From here we would then clean up the edges and punch holes on both the socket end and the rivet plate end for attachment, and then using a conical former, form the shape of the socket. Then for the tines we would start with rectangular section, drawing it out to a point for the blade, and then leaving a small section at the end to be pinched, rounded and punched for attachment. Once all the tines have been created, we can then attach them to the body using rivets. Because the spear belonged to Hereford Resource Centre, I couldn't keep it to hand, so I had to create full-scale technical drawings that I could refer back to for measurements and generate my stock estimations from. Once I had these, I could then go into the forge and start my recreation using the process that I had proposed. My first attempt at one of the central tines did not match the measurements of the original, as the punched attachment point, or what I refer to as the finger, was too long, so I had to recalculate my stock estimations for my second attempt. My second attempt was much better, as the finger came out exactly the same as the original. However, my blade was not to the right measurements, and I once again had to recalculate my stock estimations. My third attempt was extremely close to the original measurements. However, there were slight deviations that the more I looked at became even more irritating, so I made slight adjustments to my calculations and tried again. My fourth attempt was exactly to spec, and now that I had unlocked its secrets, the creation of the two other tines would be much more straightforward. Before creating what I referred to as the middle tine, I wanted to have a go at creating one of its fingers, as it requires a slightly different process than creating one of the fingers for the central tines. Instead of using the flat of the hammer on the bick to squash the material for the finger as we did for the central tine, by using the rounded side of the hammer we create these even arches on both sides of the finger. The middle tine followed the exact same creation process as we used for the central tines, however we substituted in this new finger forming technique. With the central and middle tine completed, it was now time to start on the outer tine. However, before jumping into its creation, I wanted to attempt to create the finger first. Because the fingers of the outer tine are similar in shape to the ones of the central tines, I used the exact same technique but added a little more material as they are slightly longer. I then started creation on the outer tine using a similar process as I used for the two others. However, I altered the shape of the end of the blade and used this new finger forming process. With the three tines finished, it was now time to start creation of the socket. I started by watching Alan Newbury's explanation video on YouTube of how to create a socket, and then tried this method in the forge. Then, using my technical drawings, I calculated stock estimations and generated a theoretical production process. After evaluating the initial theoretical creation process, I decided that instead of fullering and drawing material out, I would cut the shapes out from the plate, as the plate would not forge into itself easily. I did end up burning this attempt when spreading the material for the fan. However, I learnt that the material wasn't spreading enough and I would have to rethink. I decided that I would cut out a larger amount of material in a fan shape so that it would require less spreading. This was as far as I had gotten for my recreation. As for the riveting process, I have researched it and feel confident that I will be able to finish my recreation when we return to the forge. While carrying out my recreation, I did a lot of research into what I might do for my response. One of the things I looked at was the Book of Eels by Patrick Svensson, which brought up themes of tradition, consciousness, metamorphosis, and human imposition on nature. These themes carried over, as well as the physical appearance of the eel spear, as things I would look at for my response. With these in mind, I came up with response ideas such as coins printed with eels to show how eels were once used as currency, and a trident to symbolise how humanity have become the new gods of the sea with their utilisation of tools. My favourite of these response ideas was inspired by Kelly Richardson's Embers and the Giants, which is an endangered old growth forest articulated by thousands of fireflies. However, upon closer inspection, it becomes apparent that this is not a natural spectacle, and that the fireflies are in fact drones. This is used to symbolise the idea of human intervention, mimicking nature as the real thing slowly dies. This idea of having something that appears beautiful at first glance, but then under closer inspection reveals much darker themes, inspired this idea of creating a flower out of eel spear tines and then having dead eels caught between them, highlighting human ignorance and the massacre of animals for their own benefit. With a core idea established, I created a mood board consisting of images of flowers, mandalas, eels and eel spears to refer back to and influence my decisions when coming up with ideas for the creation. I then took to drawing to play around with ideas of size and arrangement of the different components of the flower. From these drawings I made cardboard maquettes that could inform me of what my ideas would look like in 3D, and I could make alterations to anything I was unhappy with. When I was finally happy with how I wanted the flower to look, I stuck together 4 sheets of A2 paper and drew these full-scale technical drawings. Cutting the circular shape into 16 sections seemed the most aesthetically pleasing choice, as it was not too cluttered but not too sparse. I kept the length of the blades the same as in the original, to reference the original item. However, I had to make them thicker so that they formed a robust structure, as they would be drowned out by eels if they were left the same. The tips of the blades are shaped to mimic those of the original item and vary from one to the other as petals would on a real flower. The fingers on the tines also vary in size, referring to the arrangement on the original, with 5mm holes also referring to the original. The blades are also beveled in the exact same way as the tines are on the original. The curve of the blades that can be seen on the side view drawing are to make the flower more 3-dimensional, while mimicking the domed shape at the centre of a real flower. Using these drawings, I created a maquette to act as a 3-dimensional representation of my design. From these drawings, I also managed to calculate stock estimations and generate a theoretical creation process. First, I would create the rivet plate by cutting out a 240mm diameter circle from 10mm plate. There are then 2 possible processes to start the creation of the tines. One consists of cutting the blanks from 10mm plate, taking into account lengths for fingers and tine tips. The second would use techniques similar to those used in the creation of the tines on the original. Personally, I would want to use the first of these 2, as it would be much more time efficient and easier to do. Regardless of which starting process you use, you will reach this point where you need to use a similar process to create the fingers of the tines as used for the recreation of the original. For the curve of the blade, an even bend would need to be made on the 80mm material between the finger and the beveling, and then a 90-degree corner so that the blade and the finger once again run in the same plane. It may be beneficial to create a jig for this process for quick and accurate recreation. Using marking tools such as chalk, rulers and dividers, create appropriate sections and then use the fingers of the tine to mark where to drill the 5mm holes in each section. Once the holes are drilled, assemble each tine using nuts and bolts to assess the shape. Once the holes for the eels have been marked and drilled, attach the tines using rivets. Once I had completed the creation process of the bladed flower, I started looking to how I was going to attach the eels and what arrangement I would have them in, using tracing paper to create different ideas. Once I had found an idea I liked, I covered my full-scale technical drawing with tracing paper and applied my idea to it. I then created eels by wrapping pipe cleaners in paper and attaching them to the flower in the style of my drawing to assess the idea in 3D. This also informed me of how long I would need the material to be to create the eels. Now I could generate a theoretical creation and assembly method for the eels. First, I would use calipers and rulers to circle out and mark where I would want my 5mm holes to be. For the eel itself, I would use 450mm of 10mm round and start by taking 20mm of the bar and turning it into a 10 and 40mm long and 5mm round. I would then forge an octagonal point on the opposing end and then run a flatter down the bar, starting 40mm above the tenon all the way to the end of the octagonal taper. These aesthetic choices are to mimic the body of a real eel. From there I would bend a sharp rounded 60-degree curve around 80mm above the tenon. Then at 80mm on the bent length, I would gently start to curve horizontally. This curved shape is again an effort to replicate the domed centre of a real flower. The eel is now ready to be attached to the main flower, by fitting the tenon through one of the drilled holes and holding the protruding length in the vise. Where the eel becomes horizontal should fit between the tines. I would then be able to use a gas torch to bend the eel around the tine. Once the eel is in position, I can cut the tenon to the appropriate length and rivet the head. Once this is repeated for every eel, the entire flower is finished. Shown in the top right corner of this image is a maquette I would make before starting the actual flower to inform me of technique, fit and timing. Below that is a stock list and the specific tools that I will need. Finally, here are two drawings of where I think the finished flower would be best situated. The first as a centerpiece on a table, and the second placed on a wall. For this example, I would need to create a bracket that would attach the flower to the wall. Thank you for listening.